These are 3 simple things you can do to start building better MLB DFS lineups. I'm Jordan Shand, SaberSim's head coach. Let's go. Tip number 1 is understand the ranges of outcomes of players. Baseball is commonly referred to as a high variance sport, and what that really means on a practical level is that players have wide ranges of outcomes of how many fantasy points they can score, and their distribution of how often they score different ranges of outcomes is pretty diverse. If you're used to playing something like NBA DFS or even NFL DFS, it's pretty easy to get in the mindset of having sure thing plays, where there are chalk plays or players that are just under projected, whose outcomes are very likely to be around that player's average projection, who are just pretty much sure things, right? I mean, there's a chance that, something goes wrong, maybe that player gets hurt or gets in foul trouble in NBA, but they're generally just, because of their salary and average projection, going to be very good plays. In baseball, that's really not the case, and that's especially true for hitters, but it's also true for pitchers. And the easiest way to just see this is to just click on a player's name in SaberSim and look at the ranges of outcomes for that player. We see the highest owned batter on the slate here tonight is going to be Jarren Duran here, closely followed by Devers. So Red Sox stack's pretty popular here tonight. And if we pull up one of these players, you can see the most common outcome for this guy is actually scoring 0 points, and that there is a set of outcomes here all around 5 points or less that makes up almost 40% of this player's total outcomes. There really are no sure things in MLB DFS. Even the best hitter playing against the worst pitcher in the best hitting park is still very commonly going to score 0 or under 5 or 6 fantasy points, which really isn't what you want for GPPs. So what are the practical takeaways here? I think there are 2 big ones. And the first is that you should be thinking about diversification. And in fact, diversification should be a pretty big part of your process for baseball. I think the easiest way to do that in SaberSim is to make use of the Min Uniques player option here. A lot of these hitters across the entire player pool for any given slate are going to have similar upside. There are a lot of different viable lineups. So you want to make sure that those lineups are as different as possible, so you're not all in on any one given team or player or stack whose most common outcomes, again, are generally well below their mean projection. The way I typically like to do this is to get a sense of, based on how many lineups I need for the contest and how many lineups I have in the pool, how high can I put this number, and then putting it 1 or 2 spots below that depending on how diverse I want to get. When we're increasing this, for example, to 4, we're saying of our set of 20 lineups, each one needs to have 4 different players from each other here, and we're pulling in different lineups from our pool into our set of 20 so that we're matching that here. And in this case, we are in a situation where we only have 35% to our highest exposed batter in the pool. So even if Starling Marte, who looks like a pretty good leverage option here against the Padres tonight at low ownership, even if he and the rest of the Mets stacks fail, which, just like for all of these other hitters, is generally their most common outcome, we're going to have a lot of different paths to first place on this particular slate. And the second takeaway here is to just be cautious of core plays or using a very condensed player pool in MLB DFS. Again, because these ranges of outcomes are pretty wide for players and there aren't a lot of sure things, if you are going all in on a set of just a couple pitchers or 1 stack or something like that, you absolutely can come up with profitable lineups using those constructions, but you are going to see that that's going to be pretty straining on your bankroll, and your expectation there should be that you are going to lose most of your slates until you're able to recoup all of your profits all in one slate where your core goes off. And if you're doing that, I think it's a wise thing to do to play a little bit less of your bankroll every slate. Again, it's not necessarily wrong to do this. You can be successful. There's plenty of successful DFS players that play a very condensed pool, but the best of them are going to be lowering their bankroll allocation for each slate to allow them to play that strategy over the long run. For me personally, I don't make any adjustments to my player pool in baseball DFS. I am playing with the full wide open pool and embracing this variance here by diversifying my lineups through Min Uniques. If you want to hear a little bit more about diversification, I have recorded a much deeper video about this concept in DFS in general, and I've linked that in the description. Now, tip number 2 is to embrace negative leverage opportunities. Now, what is negative leverage? Negative leverage in DFS is putting your lineups in a position where when other lineups in your contest fail, yours are in a better position to succeed. And most of the time that this comes up in baseball in particular is because of the correlations of players, primarily the negative correlations between pitchers and the opposing team's hitters. Now, if we just pull up any given pitcher on the slate here, like Zach Gallen, who looks like the chalkiest pitcher on this particular slate, we can see his most common negative correlations, and actually correlations period, on this slate are going to be the opposing team batters, in this case the Pittsburgh Pirates. And that makes a ton of sense intuitively, right? What situations is Zach Gallen going to do really well in this slate? Well, it's when all the Pittsburgh Pirates have bad games, and vice versa, when the Pirates all go off, Zach Gallen's not very likely to have a good game. What this means on the DFS side is that when the lineups that have Zach Gallen underperform their expectation, it probably means, or it's more likely, that lineups with Pittsburgh Pirates are overperforming their expectations. So why is this actually something that you should think about, or it should be a part of your process overall? Well, the main reason why is that a lot of the traditional tools for grading lineups, or for even just building lineups, don't deal with the problem of negative leverage very well. I'm talking about things like projected score, or ownership sum, or things like that, or even Saber score on SaberSim. They don't necessarily pick up on the fact that there are these negative leverages in a DFS contest that you can take advantage of. For example, if we have a team that is projected to be about 5% owned in a contest, facing a pitcher who is expected to be 50% owned in a contest, and then in a similar vein, we have another team that's going to be 5% owned, but the opposing team pitcher is relatively unowned. Those two teams might project the exact same, they might have the exact same ownership projections, and any of these tools for grading overall lineup quality might kind of treat those two lineups that stack those teams independently is very similar to one another. One of them has a much better negative leverage opportunity there, because when that stack goes off, 50% of the lineups in the contest are going to have a pitcher that was facing into that stack and very likely failed to meet their expectation, or at least their upside. On the other hand, the other team, Team B in this case, might just be as likely to go off as Team A in this case, but when they do, you're not getting 50% of your lineups in your contest failing alongside that outcome here. So you're competing with a lot more lineups that are still very live to win that contest, whereas in the case of Team A, a lot of the lineups in your contest are now basically dead on arrival and don't have a shot to win. Now, does this mean you should just auto-fade all the chalky hitters and all the chalky pitchers and just take the other side of all of those situations? No, there's still a balance, and a lot of times a chalky pitcher is chalky for a reason. Either they're a very good pitcher or they're facing against a bad team, and you can't just blindly be fading chalk all the time. But SaberSim, I think, allows you to do this in a very creative and effective way, and it comes from the fact that when we build lineups, two things are happening. The first is that we're building a very large pool of lineups here, not just the 20 or so you may need to enter into your contests. But second, each lineup is actually the best possible lineup for a certain simulation of the way the entire slate could have played out. So we can use information about what is present in our pool to get a sense of what stands and what fades might be more viable than others. And I have an entire video about this as well. I'll link that in the description. There's a lot of power here across multiple different sports and contest types. But as a quick example, one of the things that I like to do in baseball is get a sense of who the chalkiest pitchers on the slate are going to be. So for tonight, we have Zach Gallen, Corbin Burnes, and Hunter Brown here. All is about 20% owned. And get a sense of who is the opposing stack on the other side, and how often is that stack showing up in our pool, which is a subset of the ways that the slate might actually play out. So if we're looking here and we think we've got relatively chalky pitchers against Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Seattle, where are some opportunities maybe for some leverage here, we can check and see what stacks are actually showing up most commonly in the Sims. So I'll go over to the stacks and sort by stack pool exposure here and go looking for these teams. And the first one that pops up is Cincinnati, which is actually a top 7 stack on the slate here tonight, at least in how often they're showing up in the Sims here, about 14% of the time. We can keep going down the list and we see Seattle and Pittsburgh here a little bit lower. They're showing up about 5% of the time. Probably still viable plays, but Cincinnati really jumps out to me as a possible play here, where I'm getting direct leverage up against Corbin Burnes on a team that's showing up as the best team that could be played in 13% of our Sims here, and is actually more valuable than their projection or ownership indicates because of the negative leverage I'm getting against Corbin Burnes. So I might go ahead and bump them up here and maybe make sure I'm getting 25% or so Cincinnati stacks in my lineups. And finally, tip number 3 is to leave your heuristics and your rules of thumb at the door. Now, there are a bunch of these in MLB DFS. I'm sure you've heard plenty of them, and you're probably using quite a few of them. Things like always make sure you have a 5 stack in your lineups on DraftKings, or never use a lineup that's over 100% ownership sum, or never make sure that, or always make sure, whatever it is, that you have no more than 1 gap in your batting stacks, right? So you're not playing stacks with multiple gaps in them or whatever, right? All of these rules, the reason that they actually exist, they are not objective truths about MLB DFS strategy, that these are cornerstones of what makes a winning lineup. These are heuristics that were invented to help make traditional optimizers that only understand average projections and optimizing for an average projection, help those tools learn how to build GPP-ready lineups, right? It is not a fact that every profitable lineup in a DraftKings MLB contest has a 5-stack in it. It is not a objective truth that you can't have 2 different gaps or a gap of 2 batting order spots in your stacks, right? These were invented to help these outdated tools like traditional optimizers build better lineups. And if you've made it this far in this video, you probably already know to some extent that the main reason why you don't need to worry about these rules here with SaberSim is because we're building lineups based on simulations. We understand what makes a GPP winning lineup right out of the box here, because the lineups we are building are the best lineup possible for a simulation of the way that the slate can play out. I set no rules on this particular build here, and you see we're getting the right kinds of stacks that we would intuitively already expect here in our lineups. Also, our lineups are not just playing all of the chalk plays. We're getting well-balanced plays with the right amount of ownership in each of these lineups, just looking down the list here. But all too often I see people on SaberSim or building their lineups with simulations forcing these kinds of rules into their lineups anyway, not really understanding why these rules were a thing to begin with. Again, it is not the case that you must have that 5-stack in every single DraftKings lineup, even though we do here in this particular build here. It is just that those lineups are generally good. But what happens here is when you start to force in a ton of these rules and say, all of my lineups must have this certain type of stack type, and my lineups must have these parts of the batting order, and they must be under this part of ownership sum, and they must be over this overall projection. You are limiting your ability to build other more unique lineups in more unique constructions that are showing up in the sims. Now, I've got to give some credit to SaberSim Chris here on this one, but he makes a really good point that if you are forcing in a 5-stack in every single lineup, your ability to build a unique stack of the chalkiest stack in the field, so tonight maybe like Boston or the Dodgers or something like that, because you are building it not only the most popular stack, but in the most popular way. Similarly, if you are forcing all of your lineups to have a 1 through 5 stack or a 1 through 6 stack where there's not a gap of any more than one player, or you're only using one-offs that are batting first, second, third, or fourth in the order, all of these things are heuristics that everybody else that is playing MLB DFS has to do just to get their optimizer to build good lineups that you are now voluntarily opting into that you don't need to do because your lineups have already been built and optimized by game simulations here. And all you're doing at that point is just making your lineups look and score very similarly to what your competitors are doing in those contests. So what's the practical takeaway here? I think a lot of times I say things like these and people take away, don't touch anything. There's no value that can be added. The sims know all, make no adjustments. And that's not really what I'm trying to say here. I think there's a couple of tips that I would give for thinking about this and dealing with this problem correctly. The first is to just not set rules up front when you first sit down to build your lineups, especially with SaberSim here, right? Our general philosophy with building lineups on SaberSim is build, review, revise. And the main reason why is that's going to give you some information to work with before you start making decisions about what you want your lineups to look like. So if you go through and you're seeing lineups that you're not familiar with, or lineup constructions that maybe you typically wouldn't play, or lineups that have ownership sums or projections higher or lower than you're typically accustomed to, take a look at those and see maybe what those are doing, why or why not those lineups might actually be viable for this particular slate. If we take a look at our 4-2 stacks for this particular slate here tonight, right? Maybe a stack type that your must have a 5-stack rule would not allow into your contest here. And we take a look at this first lineup just as an example, and we see we've got some Boston bats in here. So maybe a 4-2 stack is a way to build a high upside lineup, right? We're playing well-projected hitters. It looks like we have a core Rocky stack here, 2 good pitchers on the slate. We're getting exposure to some Red Sox bats and then just playing a construction that is a little bit less likely to be played on this slate, right? Maybe this is something that we are interested in doing. But going through and looking first, building, reviewing, and then making adjustments as needed is going to be a little bit of a better approach. And the second piece of advice here is to make adjustments in a build first before setting rules and exposures and things like that up front. We already know that these 604 lineups that make up our pool here are each the best possible lineup that could have been built for a way that the slate could play out here. So if you go in and you say, I hear you, Jordan, but I've decided I'm playing 100% 5-3 stacks on this particular slate. If you go in and set your min exposure to 5-3 at 100% here, what you're doing is you're actually getting a lineup. You're choosing 150 lineups, the best 150 lineups where the winning lineup was a 5-3 stack. Whereas if you're setting that rule ahead of time, you're saying take all of these individual different simulations and build the best 5-3 lineup that was possible for that slate. But the best 5-3 lineup that was possible for that slate sim might not even have been close to the best lineup you could have built. And it might have been better for that outcome there to have gone with a 4-3 stack or a 3-3-2 stack or a 5 stack with 3 one-offs. And if you take this a little bit further, let's say you're making adjustments to get negative leverage with your lineups and you're stacking up the reds like we talked about before. Well, maybe the most profitable way to stack up the reds is actually to use smaller stacks, right? To use the reds in 2 stacks or 4 stacks or something like that. And setting your exposure up front here before the build is going to force these constructions of those negative leverage teams in ways that they actually aren't very likely to be optimal. So I know all of this is kind of theoretical here, but the big takeaway is to just recognize the fact that these rules that get tossed around and you hear time and time again and have become cornerstones of a lot of people's processes are actually just relics of outdated tools that don't build good GPP lineups, and you may not need as many, and in fact, you probably don't want as many if you're using a sim tool like SaberSim. And that's it. That's what I've got here for today's video. Let's go ahead and quickly summarize. Tip number 1 here was to recognize the wide and diverse ranges of outcomes in MLB DFS and diversify your lineups and be careful playing extremely condensed player pools. Tip number 2 was recognize negative leverage opportunities, which are situations where players may become more valuable than their projections or ownership would indicate because they are negatively correlated to other popular players in your contest. And tip number 3 is to leave a lot of the outdated rules of thumb and heuristics that are used for traditional optimizers to build semi-competitive lineups at the door with a sim tool like SaberSim. It's okay to still use some of those things and make adjustments, but you should be trying to do so in a way that helps support the simulations rather than disrupt them. If you have any other questions about SaberSim or MLB DFS strategy in general, there's a couple channels you can do that. You can drop it as a comment in this video, you can post a message in our Discord server, or you can email us at support@sabersim.com. And in the meantime, thank you all for watching and good luck.